In 1978, in the quaint Austrian town of Amstetten, Josef Fritzl applied for permission to convert his basement into an atomic shelter. No one considered his request odd. It was the height of the Cold War, and fear of a nuclear attack from the Soviets had swept the country. He even received a £2,000 grant from the local council to help with the building costs. He acquired supplies through contacts at construction companies that he was previously employed at. As a qualified electrical engineer, Josef was capable of handling the majority of the labour himself. It took a total of 6 years for him to complete construction and his plan to come to fruition. On August 28, 1984, he called his daughter Elizabeth, who was 18 at the time, down to the basement to help him hoist the door into its frame. Little did she know that she would not come back out of the basement for 24 years. Josef and his wife Rosemary reported her disappearance to the police. Investigators found a pattern almost immediately. 2 years prior to the incident, Elizabeth and a friend ran away to Vienna. That was one of several times when her father or authorities had to drag Elizabeth back to Amstetten. Days after she had disappeared, a letter from Elizabeth showed up in the mail. It stated that she joined a cult and that no one should come looking for her because she was safe. It was confirmed that the handwriting was Elizabeth's. However, no one knew that Josef forced his daughter to write it in order to ward off police. The case was closed, but investigators were still suspicious. Testimonies from friends and neighbours had surfaced contradicting the likelihood of Elizabeth abandoning her home for a cult. Rumours about how Josef wasn't the model citizen that he had appeared to be had caught wind. Investigators had the notion that Josef was a strict, authoritative figure behind closed doors. They knew that he had something to do with his daughter's disappearance, and found it most likely that she'd run away from him rather than join a cult. The case remained closed and Elizabeth remained feet below her family, confined to an underground labyrinth where her father tormented, abused and raped her for over 2 decades. Elizabeth had been chloroformed by her father and she woke to find herself in handcuffs. The room was dimly lit and alien to her. Josef had built a secret section of the basement. The only way to gain access to this area was to enter the correct passcode on a keypad hidden behind a row of shelves and shimmy through a tiny concrete reinforced door. Behind the door was a narrow hall with a ceiling that was barely more than 5.5 feet from the ground. Different sections of the hall would take you to one of the 2 bedrooms, the bathroom, the living area, or the padded chamber. The chamber was insulated and soundproof. Josef was meticulous in his planning or sought to ensure that no amount of calls for help or screaming could be heard by anyone. For a long time, the only interactions Elizabeth would have with another person would be at night with her father when he came down to rape her. Years later, police would estimate that she'd been raped by him around 3,000 times. Elizabeth was impregnated by her father 5 years into her detainment. Instead of consulting a doctor or rushing Elizabeth to the hospital when needed, Josef brought her supplies and a book that instructed her on how to conduct an at-home birth. Elizabeth would eventually have to go through the process of birthing 7 of her father's children. Despite her circumstances, Elizabeth did everything she could to be an active and loving mother. Her children grew up in a layer with no windows and only a tube television and books to fuel their imaginations. Elizabeth taught them to read and write and offered the best possible education that she could provide. The physical and mental abuse spread to her children. They all lived in fear that one day he would make good on his threats and shut the door to the basement forever, turning the bunker into a tomb as they starved to death. In 1996, Elizabeth gave birth to twins. One of the newborns, Michael, suffered from respiratory failure. Despite Elizabeth's cries and pleas, Josef refused to take Michael to the hospital. Shortly after, Michael died. Josef stuffed the infant's body into an incinerator and burned away any evidence that Michael had ever been born. Eventually, there was not enough room in the basement to support Elizabeth and her remaining 6 children. In the middle of the night, Josef took 3 of the noisiest children and placed them at his own doorstep. He forced Elizabeth to write another letter, stating that she was unable to support these children and that she wished for her parents to take them in. Josef and Rosemary legally adopted all 3 children. In the coming years, as they grew up, completely unaware of the circumstance of their births, the children lived relatively normal lives. Josef weaponized their upbringing and would taunt the others in the basement with stories of how their siblings lived exciting lives where they could run and play in the daylight. In 2008, years after talk and speculation about the disappearance of Elizabeth had been quieted, a 19-year-old girl named Kirsten was rushed into the emergency room. She suffered from lung and kidney failure and was immediately placed in intensive care. To the hospital's surprise, they were unable to find any medical history in the national database. The medical staff turned to Josef Fritzl for answers. He was uncooperative and repeatedly demanded that Kirsten be treated so that she could go home. The hospital grew increasingly wary of Josef and contacted the police. Facing authorities, he admitted that Kirsten is the daughter of Elizabeth Fritzl, the girl who disappeared over 2 decades ago. He insisted that he discovered Kirsten at his door with a note from Elizabeth, pleading for her family to take care of her ill child. Shortly after her admittance into the hospital, Kirsten went into a coma. The hospital and authorities recognised that they weren't getting much help from her grandfather, so they appealed for anyone who may have information on Elizabeth's whereabouts on the local news and in the paper. Exactly 1 week after Kirsten's arrival, Josef returned accompanied by Elizabeth. This was her first time being outside the basement since she was 18 years old, and medical staff were shocked by her appearance. She was 42, but looked years beyond that. Elizabeth was pale and sickly, similar to Kirsten's appearance when she arrived. Elizabeth was escorted to the police station and questioned. She refused to speak to where she had been the last 24 years. For the most part, she sat in silence as the barrage of questions seemed as endless as the basement itself. Finally, after 5 hours and a promise from the police that she'll never have to see Josef again, Elizabeth told them the truth. She relayed details of sexual abuse and beatings and imprisonment. Josef was arrested at the age of 73 and charged with rape, incest, kidnapping, slavery and murder. In the courtroom, his initial defense was that he wanted to protect Elizabeth from a world that was not suitable to live in. However, Elizabeth was called to the stand and gave a testimony which caused Josef to fold and admit to everything just before apologising. He was sentenced to life in prison. Years earlier, before he built the bunker, Josef Fritzl would routinely sit in the street and watch couples become intimate through their bedroom windows. This led to him following women in parks and publicly masturbating. He would eventually follow a woman to her home and rape her there. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison. Rosemary didn't leave him and even told his relatives that Josef was away for work. Shortly after his release, he sought permission to build the atomic shelter. In 2008, Josef confessed to authorities that he was born to rape. Police and Elizabeth both cleared Rosemary, disbelieving that she had any knowledge or involvement in Elizabeth's imprisonment. She lived in fear of her husband and was also a prisoner in a certain sense. Elizabeth and her children spent a year in a clinic learning how to adapt to a normal life. They now live with Rosemary in a secret location, have new names and refuse media exposure. The dungeon has since been filled with cement in order to prevent anyone from ever going down there again.